Here's the dummy I told you about that I made with Mr. Q, and it has my foundation garments on it, so that would be the chemise that goes next to your skin. If you don't already know, your stays do not go on next to your skin. This light little dress goes on underneath, and mine is made out of a very light linen. Some people make them with ruffles and ruffles around the sleeves so they show over the top of their dress. It's completely personal, and I have my stays fitted on the same width that I wear my stays. So this isn't an exact replica of my body, but it's close enough for a quick fitting. And excuse the mess, there are a number of different projects going on in this project room right now. And so let's go over and I'll talk about assembling the bodice lining. All right, so I'm getting ready to assemble the bodice lining, and I'm putting together pieces 2 and 3, the front and back. And I just wanted to show you that when we lay out the pieces here, the pattern pieces, they look really nice. They line up together like that. But when you go to actually pin the pieces together, you get something that looks like this. And if you're like me and you're making one of these for the first time, you say, how do I sew that together? Because we're used to, in modern clothes, the seam being nice and straight, and we just sew it together. The reason for that is that this seam is going to be rounded for the back of the dress. It's going to fit around your back as your back is rounded. So what we're going to do is we start pinning by the little notch, and you notice that when we pick it up, it fits together. So we have a nice rounded seam. So you're just going to pin the notch piece first and very carefully keep the edges lined up together and put in your pins, and you'll have a nice rounded seam when you're done. And as you can see, I've done this with both sides. So I have the back bodice pieces, lining pieces, ready to be sewn to the front piece. And you can see that's a nice rounded seam we're going to get. It doesn't flatten out, so we're going to have to sew it very carefully so that we get, when it opens, that'll be a nice rounded seam. And you'll see that a little bit better after I sew it for you. So hold on, and I'm going to go sew this. All right, so I've sewn those pieces together, but before I talk about that, here's the part of the instructions that talk about assembling the bodice lining. And I just wanted to mention that before you start a project like this, it's a really good idea to read through all of the assembly instructions. And I usually end up reading through 3 or 4 times and marking anything that looks unusual or difficult to understand for me. Inevitably, you're going to get to a part in the assembly that doesn't make any sense. So sometimes I'll read through the instructions even 3, as I mentioned, or 4 times, so that I can picture the entire assembly of the garment before I even start sewing anything, often before I even cut. So it's a good idea to read through and figure out if there's anything you don't understand and go back to it and try to envision it before you begin. So just a warning that it's a good idea to read through all the instructions first. And here is our lining. And that's that nice rounded seam I mentioned to you that I talked about before that fits just behind the armhole as part of the back seam. And this is the back closure. This closes with either hooks and eyes or just drawstrings. For it to be completely authentic, I think it would just be a drawstring type of closure. Now notice this is machine stitched. I don't stitch any of my interior seams by hand because it just takes too long. I know there are purists who do, but I'm not one of them. I do, however, and you'll see later, stitch all of the seams that show by hand. So all of the hems and any lace, ruffles, things like that, I'll sew by hand. So now we have the front and back sewn together, and the next thing we're going to do is attach that shoulder strap. Okay, so I've gone ahead and sewn the shoulder straps on and placed this on my dummy. And you can see these shoulder straps have been added here. And the back is fitted very nicely. See, it fits down to a nice taper in the back. And the edges are meant to come right together. So once those back edges are hemmed, they'll meet very nicely. And you can see this nice taper. And this was that rounded seam we were talking about. So that looks very nice as well. And I recall from reading my instructions that some work needs to be done to fit the front. And you see we have a gap in the top here. We'll be putting some little darts in here to tighten that up. And around the bottom, we'll be putting a couple rows of gathering stitches, just wide stitches that we can pull together to make this nice and snug around the bottom. So far it looks like this size is going to fit me pretty well. I should mention that all of the seams I do initially, I do with something called a basting stitch, which is a very long stitch. It's real easy to pull out if you make a mistake or if something doesn't fit. And then once it's all fitted, I go ahead and put in final stitches. I know maybe that sounds crazy to you and like a lot of work, but when you're using a pattern for the very first time you haven't used before, a type of garment you haven't made or worn before, it really is worth it to be fixated on these little things in the beginning, so that you don't have to take the whole thing apart or wind up with a dress that you can't wear. So I am going to go ahead and fix the front of that bodice lining so that it's nice and snug, and I will be back. Okay, so we can see I've done a little bit more work here. The first thing I did was go ahead and put in those 2 rows of gathering stitches around the bottom, and I did that by hand while this was here right on my dummy. And if you're wondering how I went straight across, it is no big magic feat or great talent on my part, but that I used this little instrument here. And this actually belonged to my mom, and I set this at 5/8 inch and moved it across the fabric as I sewed the first at 5/8 and the second just below it at 3/8. That was a big step forward in my sewing family when my mom bought that little tool, because before that she, like my grandmother, just used to put a rubber band around the end of a ruler, and you could use a rubber band too. So you can see I put in those gathering stitches, and now we fit nicely around the waist. I also, by the way, put some pins in the back to secure the back where it will fit once it's on me. And then I went ahead and I pinned those darts to gather the top part of the lining so that it's not gaping open. Now, I didn't sew that for a couple reasons. One, I might use a lower neckline. Once I actually try this on, I might decide I want the neckline to be a little lower, so I'll have to cut it and refit it. And secondly, I've worked with my, crazy handmade dummy here enough to know that it is not 100% representation of how I am shaped in my stays. So I definitely don't want to do that, sew that until I try it on. And also these gathering stitches, by the way, I haven't secured at this end in case I need to make them a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. So the next thing to do is to take, there's my doggy, the next thing to do is to take all of this off the dummy, put it on me, and try that lining out on me and see how it's fitting. So that's our next step, and I'll be back to show you that. Okay, so here it is now on me, and excuse the pink wires, but you can see those darts look pretty good there. I've also gathered the bottom around my stays so that it's nice and snug, and with the help of Mr. Q, it's pinned to the back. So this is pretty good for a first fitting. I have to say I'm pretty impressed. I don't usually get it this close the first time around. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust these darts just a little bit, as I have a little bit too much play in here. I'm going to adjust those a little bit, and then I'm going to sew the darts, put it back on, make sure it fits, and then we'll be ready to do the silk bodice. Not bad at all, I must say. I'm kind of liking this. I think we're going to have a good result here. So I'll be back, and we'll see how it comes out. Okay, so you can see that I have altered this. I've put the little darts in the top, gathered up the bottom, and I've also reinforced all of the seams with a regular machine stitch now, so that all of the seams are in place. You'll see that the gathering is not exactly to my model here, because it's exactly to me when I'm in my stays. And as I mentioned before, that is a little bit different from the way my dummy appears. Now, someone on Facebook asked me about those shoulder straps and the location of the side seams. And if you take a look at this, if this was going to be a fitted dress, you could see right away that that side seam a little bit further back from the arm does make the chest look much wider across the top, across here, right? It gives you an illusion of width across here. But if you come around to the back, you can see the seams in the back being closer together. So this is really our side seam here. Sometimes the side seam is about here, and then this seam is here as well. And you have the shoulder straps, gives a nice tapered look to the back. Now you're not going to see this on the finished garment because it's all gathered around. But if this was to be a fitted bodice, you can see that nice V shape in the back that it gives you, that nice illusion of a, or not illusion, the reality of a tapering down to the waist, while in the front we have a nice wide appearance to the top of the chest area here. So I think that really is the purpose for that shoulder strap and the seam being located where it is. I don't know, because I said I'm not a costume or clothing historian, but as somebody who sews, it seems to be the effect of having those seams located there. So this is all ready to go, and the next thing we have to do is lay out our pattern pieces and begin cutting our silk. I should mention here that I have gone through and restitched all of the seams with a regular size seam that will hold and stay in place forever, I hope. And I've also pressed open all of the seams, as you can see here. So this is pretty much all finished and ready to be attached to the silk bodice once we have that cut out. And here's the section of the instructions, and the next segment we'll be looking at laying out the fabric, placing the pattern pieces, and cutting them out.